Welcome everyone to our lunchtime lecture for May. I'm Patricia Shampton, Director of Alumni Relations for Texas Access. We're going to hear from another outstanding professor today, but before we do, I want to thank you for donating to the association when you registered. We couldn't do this type of programming without you and your support and generosity, so thank you again. Today's lecture is called Racism is Not Ignorance, It's Knowledge. And our guest is Dr. Eric Tang, an associate professor in the African and African Diaspora Studies Department and director of the Center for Asian American Studies. Dr. Tang is a former community organizer and has published several articles on race and urban social movements, including award-winning writing on post-Katrina New Orleans, and he's working on his second book called Fire in the Streets, about the urban rebellions of the late 1960s. Locally, Tang's research focuses on the past and present of racial segregation in Austin, and specifically about the gentrification-driven displacements of the city's long-standing African-American residents. He co-authored the report Outlier, The Case of Austin's Declining African-American Population, which revealed that Austin was the only major growing city in the United States to experience an absolute numerical decline in African-Americans. Welcome, Dr. Tang, and thank you so much for being with us today. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Patricia. Thank you, Roxanne, and all the folks at Texas X's who did the work of putting this together, as well as a number of great lunchtime lecture series talks over the year, and doing it on Planet Zoom, no less, or Planet Microsoft Teams, I guess we're on. It's great to be with all of you this afternoon and to talk about this important issue, which is clearly on the minds of so many, and that issue being racism and anti-racism. And it happens to also be the 1-year anniversary since the murder of George Floyd. May 25th, 2020 was when that happened, and that was a true turning point for the United States. It was a moment in which a new conversation and a mass conversation about systemic racism took hold of the country. And since then, there have been discussions about what exactly racism is. How do we know it when we see it? What isn't racism? And what could then be an effective anti-racism once we understand the terms in play? And so that's what we're going to talk about today. And I'm probably going to go for 15, 20 minutes. I would say 20 minutes. I tend to be long-winded. And then we're going to open it up for conversation. So I hope to use the majority of the hour to have conversations with all of you. Okay, so we're going to begin with a statement that may sound familiar to most of you. And that statement is racism is ignorance, or racists are ignorant. Show of hands, how many of you have heard this term before? I can't really see you, but I'll pretend that that's a very sizable number of the crowd has heard this term before, that racists are ignorant. And today I want to begin with a provocation. The provocation being, what if the opposite were true? What if racism is about knowledge? What if, in order to be racist, one needs to be profoundly knowledgeable? What if racists know what they want? In other words, what if racism is about desire? And I offer this provocation because if racism were about ignorance, about not knowing, or being misinformed, then it would follow that the antidote to racism would be correct information. In other words, that racism as ignorance or misinformation could be corrected through education. Anti-racism as a form of educating. And it follows that many of the proposals coming from anti-racist advocates, especially over the past year, begin and end with educating the public. So for instance, we might take this statement, right, by someone who has racist views, but then gets defensive and says, you know, I'm not really racist. It's just that these immigrants and refugees are stealing our jobs. Like, this was a refrain that you may have heard of in the past, okay? It may be familiar to you. And the anti-racist will say, well, what we need to do is we need to challenge this racist thinking by providing information that is correct, by showing that actually immigrants and refugees don't steal jobs. And that would then correct the racist attitudes and behaviors. Okay, well, two scholars, Jens Heinmuller and Daniel J. Hopkins, did a study about anti-immigrant views in the United States and Western Europe. And what they discovered is that despite this prevailing assumption that anti-immigrant and anti-refugee views are driven by economic concerns, they're actually not. So they tested this theory and they asked people with anti-immigrant views, why do you have anti-immigrant views? And the majority of them responded by saying that it really had nothing to do with the economy or economic competition. We just don't like them. We don't like what they're doing to the culture. We don't like what they symbolize. And in their study, and I'll quote their study, they say, quote, as an explanation of mass attitudes toward immigration, the labor market competition hypothesis has repeatedly failed to find empirical support, making it something of a zombie theory. And by that, I think they mean that, like zombies, that theory just keeps coming back. It won't die. It's The Walking Dead. We keep fighting on the ground of trying to argue that immigrants and refugees don't steal jobs, right? But the truth is that most people who hold anti-immigrant views don't even care about that. So what do they care about, according to Heinmuller and Hopkins? Well, what they care about, and here again I'll quote them, is instead, research finds that immigration attitudes are shaped by sociotropic concerns about its cultural impacts, and to a lesser extent, its economic impacts on the nation as a whole. So what they're saying is there are these ineffable reasons for why people don't like immigrants, and they have very little or less to do with economic concerns. Meaning that if you were to go ahead and then tell somebody who holds anti-immigrant views, actually, your data about who immigrants are and whether or not they steal jobs and whether or not refugees are a drain on our social welfare state, that's all incorrect. They wouldn't care. It wouldn't make a difference. And I share this with you also from, a personal, with some personal experience around this. A few years ago, I was invited to New York City by the International Rescue Committee, which is one of the largest refugee resettlement agencies in the world. They invited me up because I'd written a book about refugees and how they survive urban poverty. And they wanted me to make the case, along with other scholars, that refugees actually make a positive economic contribution to the country. And they were asking scholars to help make this case because of so much of the anti-refugee rhetoric that was coming from our own government. And that anti-refugee rhetoric being, based in the notion that refugees, again, are a drain on our economy, that they take more than they give. And I asked a simple question. I said, okay, if we were to prove this out in a report, what difference would it actually make? How would it actually change people's views? And the organizers had to admit that it probably wouldn't. It probably wouldn't. And so as researchers, as academics, we have to ask ourselves, do we sometimes send ourselves on fool's errands by asking the wrong question? Okay. So where does this leave us? What are these sociotropic and cultural concerns, right? How do we understand them? Well, they are, in other words, things like nationalism, like this sense of citizenship. They are notions of masculinity that are tethered to our sense of national security. There are these ineffable psychological goals that make our identities. And so the question becomes, how do we come to desire these things? That's really the question that I think is at the heart of all this. What is, in other words, the process by which racists arrive at racist desires, right? If it's not about the economy, if it's about these cultural, if you will, if I can use that as a shorthand, elements, desires, then how do people arrive at them? Okay, that might be the key question we need to ask in order to understand what we need to do about racism. And here I might add that certain attempts at educating the public might actually reinforce those desires, those negative or toxic desires. And here, just, a quick sidebar, there's all this research coming out now about how when people are given so-called correct information, the facts, they actually double down on their beliefs as opposed to become converted to something else. They actually begin to think that this attempt to convert me with facts is part of the broader, conspiracy, if you will, to take away something from me, to remove me from what I know I want, right? And therefore, this notion that if we keep educating the public, that we might actually end racism could actually have this adverse effect. That's just something to consider when we move into the Q&A. Okay. But let's go to this question of how people come to desire certain things. And here I want to point us to the theory of mimetic desire as scripted by literary and cultural theorist Rene Gerard. So Rene Gerard argues that when we desire something, and here on this chart, what we desire could be described as the self, a sense of national belonging, a feeling of domination, a feeling of security. When we desire these things, it's never just me as the desiring subject that says, oh, I want this, right? There's something innate in me that says, here's what I desire. Instead, our desires are always mediated by a model. We're always imitating some other person or thing or subject that then shapes our desire. Okay? And so our desires are not, again, innate. There's nothing natural about them. They're shaped. And so we'll look at people who we perceive to have a dominant disposition, who we perceive to be paragons of nationalism. And we'll say, what are they doing in order to have that, right? And we will mimic that behavior. Whatever they desire, and here again, nationalism, citizenship, masculinity, well, I want that too, and I'm going to mimic them. So he calls this mimetic desire, mimesis, right? Imitation, okay? And so desire is always triangular, right? Desire, in other words, is shaped in the culture. It's shaped by what we see. We desire what others desire. Okay. But Gerard notices something about this. He notices that there's a certain point at which these mimetic desires could fall into crisis, because the desiring subject will eventually imitate the model so well that the desiring subject becomes a rival, becomes somebody whose competitive force threatens the model. And this could lead to major conflict in society. Society could fall into war, could fall into crisis when the desiring subject and the model become rivals. And Gerard says what prevents society from collapsing into crisis in such a way is when the desiring subject and the model team up and find another object to concentrate their hatred upon. And he calls that object the scapegoat. And here Gerard is borrowing from literary and cultural theorist Kenneth Burke, who coins the notion of the scapegoat mechanism. And so whereas the desiring subject and the model were in a relationship of mimesis in the previous slide, here they team up and avoid rivalry by engaging in collective violence against the scapegoat. They find a guilty party in society, someone or a population upon which to concentrate their collective violence. And what that does is it stabilizes their rivalry. It allows them to both partake in these broader goals. Okay, and so the scapegoat is an absolutely guilty object that the desiring subject and the model can both agree upon. And without getting too heady about it, if one is to believe in the absolute guilt of a person or a thing, it paradoxically means that their guilt is always held in suspicion as well. Absolute guilt conveys the notion of the possibility of innocence, if that paradox makes any sense. Okay, so what does this tell us then about racism? If this chart helps reductively explain how racism happens, what it tells us is that racism is always triangular. That racists are always in pursuit of goals in excess of their so-called hatred for the targets of their racism, i.e. the scapegoat. Whereas we might think of racism as, oh, here I'm this individual and I just kind of hate this person. What this theory is telling us is that no, there's always a third party involved. That racism is never bilateral or linear. It's not just two-party. That there's always a goal being achieved, something sustained. It also tells us that victims of racism are always necessary, so long as we have those goals. For the racist, life without that object of hatred is unimaginable, in the words of post-colonial theorist and psychiatrist Frantz Fanon. Unimaginable. So where does this leave us? More precisely, what are we to do about this? How can we even think about an effective anti-racism in light of this? I guess the question I'm asking is, how do we change people's desires? Well, here's the punchline: you can't. You can't educate people out of their desires. What we might be able to do, though, towards an effective anti-racism is challenge the goals by changing the cultural conversation. Okay, so what does that mean? If we go back to the slide, if you can picture it, I don't want to mess with the slides here, but if we can go back and picture that slide of mimetic desire, right? Where we learn to desire by imitating how others desire in the culture. Then on that very terrain of culture, what if there was room, right, for other conversations, for other ways of being, for other goals? What if we were able to practice desiring other goals and modeling that? I know that's a bit abstract, but let me try my best to give it some concreteness with the following example. Going back to me being called up to New York by the International Rescue Committee to prove that refugees are good. What if they called me up to prove that refugees might not be good, but like everyone else, that they're complicated individuals who do their best to survive? What if we change the cultural conversation from good and bad, deserving and not deserving, to one of, here are people who have survived traumas, both physical and psychological, and we don't need for them to be good or bad in order to recognize their humanity? How might we practice on the terrain of culture different kinds of conversations that then might model something else? The other thing I want to say towards an effective anti-racism is that for those who are being scapegoated, that is, the victims of racism, they should avoid at all costs the trap of countering such racism with positive images. So let's go to that other slide with the scapegoat mechanism. The notion of you being a scapegoat is terrifying. And the immediate impulse that you might have is to prove that you are not all the things that they say you are. To prove your Americanness, to prove that you are an economic contributor. But that's a trap, because all it does is reward the racism to begin with by affirming its logic. So the more you do that, the more you say, I'm not these things, look at me, positive images, the more you reinforce that triangle. And so for the scapegoated, how might you also engage in other ways of representing you and your community beyond positive images, but in ways that break that cycle, that triangle? So what I'm offering is not a prescription for anti-racism. What I am offering are some suggestions about how we might go about changing goals, broader cultural goals, which then might be able to alter the ways in which people desire certain things or what they desire in a given context. And all of this is not guaranteed. So what I'm ultimately gesturing towards is a politics without guarantees. And with that, I will conclude and hand it to Patricia for the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tang. That was really wonderful. We do have some questions coming in, so I'm just going to jump right in. One, Texas X says, I find conversations around racism blame white supremacy, but this year has also highlighted a lot of tensions between Black and Asian communities. Can you comment on racism between minorities?
Yeah, one of the things that I think is really clear about this theory is that it's not, limited to any one racial group. We all have the potential to be seduced by all kinds of goals. This isn't to say that when the persecutors or perpetrators of violence, when one is perpetrating violence, that they are always already the same as another person who does it, right? It's more complicated than that. But if I understand the question correctly, are we all capable of engaging in this? Absolutely. And I think it's limiting. It's foreclosing the conversation to say that it could only be carried out by certain groups. At the same time, it's mistaken to say that when one group does it, it's the exact same thing as when another group does it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And kind of along those same lines is, do you believe scapegoating is the reason for violence against Asians? Or is it more complex than that?
Yeah, no, it's yes, but it's also no. And the no comes from the fact that I don't think we have a real clear, deep sense of what the scapegoat is.
Yeah.
These are not just people that we irrationally hate. They are figures that are enlisted by racists in order to carry out something very specific, right? And so I agree with the statement so long as it recognizes the goals that are in play. I disagree with it to the extent that it reduces racism to just this irrational hatred for another person, like one-to-one, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it absolutely does. Thank you. Got another one here. Dr. Tang, you talked about desire as being shaped in the culture, but is there not innate non-mimetic desire, like human sexuality or evolutionary or survival-based desires for food or a child for its mom, those sorts of things?
Yeah, so according to Rene Gerard, there are certain, you know, appetites we have that are not, or things that we need, they're necessities that that we require as human beings. So food, shelter, all those things. And what he is pointing towards is this human condition. Beyond those necessities, we also have these desires. And he believes, he argues, based on the work of Kenneth Burke, that those desires are always mediated, that they're not innate, that they're always based in mimesis, in imitation.
Okay, so kind of just turning this around a little bit. So on the education, you opened up with saying that education is not always the way to prevent racism, that sometimes it can contribute to racism. So one question that's coming in is if educating, modeling, and pointing out facts that are not effective, what can we do if we're aspiring to be anti-racist to improve things? How do we work in the world? What are some examples that we can practice?
So, again, and just to kind of clarify, because I don't want to conflate education with modeling with anti-racist practice. What I'm suggesting is that the notion that if you just give people information like immigrants are good, they contribute economically, they actually don't commit crimes, that won't do the work of anti-racism. That isn't in that form of anti-racism being effective is not in evidence. And yet, I guess the implicit critique that I'm engaged in here is, even though it's not in evidence, it seems to be the go-to solution that so many advocates call for. Okay. And to the other part of the question, then what do we do? Again, I think it's about beginning different kinds of conversations that don't begin with asserting the virtues or the bad characteristics of any particular group, but allowing them to be as complicated, as contradictory as anyone else. I think it begins with, those of us who recognize that poverty is endemic in certain neighborhoods that are non-white, and that in turn, that poverty will sociologically lead to more crime. Having an open conversation about that, as opposed to trying to prove in some ways that poor communities are not violent. I guess to answer the question, and I'm just going to kind of sound like a stuck record this afternoon, what I would begin doing by way of anti-racism is to avoid positive images. Avoid the good news, but invite us to have more complicated conversations about what these communities are doing and who they are.
Okay. There's several other questions along that same one, so I'm just going to go to one that's a little bit different. It actually goes to one that we've talked about before, but is there only one sort of category or type of racism that's being studied and that you quoted here today? Or are there variations on racist beliefs depending upon the situation, the politics, even the era that we're in?
Yeah, what I presented today was a general theory for how racism happens. And it could only be just that,
Yeah.
general theory. And if I understand the question correctly, do we then need to take each situation for its particularity? Absolutely. There's, you know, there's the only way in which this makes sense is in the particular or in the concrete. If I understand the question correctly.
That was my understanding as well. Thank you. So this one is a little bit different, and it's based in history a little bit. You know, was the USA's reaction to communism after World War II and during the Cold War racism?
And
you can say that's a big topic, but
possibly.
Okay.
You know, I will say that its response was certainly aligned with its foreign policy.
Yeah.
You know, at least, you know, its response to certain refugees and its lack of response to others. I'll leave that one there.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So Courtney, I'm having some technical difficulties seeing the rest of the questions, but I know that there's some that have just come in. Can you jump on and read those questions?
I can. Let me see what we got here. What are your thoughts on how social media has been used to further divide communities and to perpetuate racism?
Could you run that back one more time?
Sure. What are your thoughts on how social media has been used to further divide communities and to perpetuate racism?
I think that social media has intensified the degree to which people will double down on their already sedimented and rooted beliefs and desires, meaning that it is capable of convincing people that, you know, the facts and information they may be getting, which are supposed to be correctives to how they think, are only part of a broader attempt to take something from them. And in that sense, I think social media underscores what I talked about earlier, which is that the work that we may be doing to inundate others with the facts that will convince them out of their racism could actually have the opposite effect.
Thank you for that. We have another one here. What about the desire to present a positive image? For example, I'm thinking of a time that I was in a fancy Berkshire Brothers in Tyler, Texas, like a Central Market. That was just one African-American shopper in the store, and this gentleman was dressed as a standard conservative, golf shirt, slacks. Is this a trap of presenting a positive image mitigated by the culture of that area, or is this in some way a sign of progress if compared to that area decades ago, which may not have had any African Americans in such a store?
Yeah, that's a great.
I was a little confused.
No, that's a great question. I think I get it, and even if I have an approximate sense of what the question is getting at. Okay, so a couple of things could be happening in that scene. On the one hand, you know, the image of a sharply dressed person who otherwise doesn't belong, right, can, in our immediate response, lead us to believe that they are changing the minds of the dominant culture, of people who hold otherwise racist views of this person. But I don't know if that's actually happening. What I think is happening is that the dominant view, the racist view, may hold this person out as some kind of exception, some kind of outlier. And the ability to kind of enlist an outlier works to reinforce the dominant logic as opposed to challenge it, right? The exception reinforces it, the dominant logic. But something else could also be happening that's really interesting, and that is the way in which certain marginalized communities, oppressed communities, people who don't belong will sometimes, in their own way, mimic, appropriate, reappropriate the styles of the dominant culture in order to resist it, in order to do something subversive, right? And that, I think, is actually an interesting cultural move, an interesting anti-racist move, right? They're not trying to be white and wealthy when they take on certain fashions, certain brand names. They may actually be trying to subvert it through some sort of play. This is exactly what drag is, right? It's not an attempt to appeal to heteronormativity, but to undermine it.
Thank you for that. This one was popping up in my head as well. What role can diversity and inclusion training play in better understanding our responsibility? Is that the same as what you were kind of referring to earlier as education, or is it more of an awareness training? I'll let you kind of think on that a little bit.
Yeah, that's a huge question too, and I'm going to say that I can't fully answer that question because no two trainings are the same. You know, there may be some training that actually is steeped in, you know, the politics of positive images and the politics of providing, you know, these correctives to a structure of racism that only reinforces that racism. And then there could be others that are more transformative. So I don't want to make any generalizations about these trainings, especially in this political moment when I do feel that there are you know, criticisms of it that homogenize these things without even knowing what they are. So I would say that, you know, we have to take kind of each anti-racist training discussion module, you know, for what it is in its particularity, and we can't make generalizations about it.
Thank you for that. We have another question here. Is racism about race or otherness? And then I'll just add to that, is racism different than, you know, other things that we're looking at for inclusion or otherness, other marginalized communities, or is there a difference between race and the sphere of otherness, if you will?
Yeah, I think that, you know, racism is never something that we can understand independent of other forms of power, right? And the ways in which race is used to power over others is always gendered, it's always sexualized, it's always classed. And so one way of answering the question is to say that race doesn't exist independent of these other structures. There's never a moment in which you are only, as a person who identifies as non-white, as part of a racial minority group, not also somebody who's gendered and sexualized and classed. Okay, and so that's one way of answering the question. I think the other thing I hear in the question is whether or not these forms of power and desire that I elaborated on in the presentation are applicable to other forms of oppression. I believe they are. But again, the general is only as useful as our ability to analyze the particular.
Thank you for that. We have a few questions that we started on a little bit earlier, but I would just like to kind of reframe the question a little bit. If a lot of what you are teaching us today or informing us on today is this, you know, not having our first reaction towards what we believe to be racism to be kind of a debate, right? Let me give you the counter to what it is that you're saying, but instead talk about positive characteristics, or sorry, stay away from positive images, but talk more about discussions of individuals and humanity.
Mm-hmm.
And can you give us kind of an example of how that would be, or I should say, and how do we affect change on a larger scale if it's really down to the individuals and not an education component, if you will?
Yeah. So, you know, I guess I should begin by saying that I don't. My argument isn't one of individual transformation, like changing people's individual desires. I don't know if that's what the question was implying, but what but that isn't where I was going with it. The other thing I will say is, and I'm saying this not to avoid the question, but because I think one of the problems with the current discussion is we want people to give us some prescription for anti-racism without first understanding what a racism is and where it comes from. And so maybe what I should do, for the sake of, you know, all of us walking away with something, with a clear takeaway from today, is to say that I don't have a prescription for anti-racism, but what I do have are some provocations that might lead us to a better theory of what a racism is, so that then people can start thinking about how they want to be anti-racist. And what I am offering is an opportunity to have all of us interrogate our goals, our desires for how we want the world to look, and what we believe is meaningful and secure, and that brings us a sense of, you know, of wholeness and identity. Are those things that comport with anti-racism? Can I still want these things and see the world in the way I do, and at the same time have the anti-racist world that I want? Or are those things in contradiction? That's really what the point of it is today.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that. This one kind of goes into that. I think we've covered most of the topics in these questions, but just piggybacking on what you just said, this person says, isn't racism just a form of tribalism that thus so innate in primate behavior, it really can't be externally modulated, but requires activating different neural pathways and overcoming? I guess, do we have to change the way our natural brains work, or is it really down to that?
So there's a whole academic field dedicated to brain science and how our brains may or may not be wired for racism. And I'm not knowledgeable enough on that topic to speak on it. So I guess I could just end there, but I probably won't. What I'll probably offer in in addition to that is that it's not adequately in evidence to me that tribalism is biologically wired into us. You know, like, without being an expert in the brain science, I'm just not convinced that we are hopelessly forever wired for this. At least that's not in evidence to me.
Yes, thank you. We just have a request, and I know you had it on a slide before, but I just want to say that we would be sending out this recording. I know Patricia's going to touch a little bit about that on it, but they would love to get some references for some of the research that you cited in this presentation. And I'm just going to say out loud that we should be able to include a little bit of information in our follow-up.
Yeah, absolutely. I could send along some titles. Sure. Is that what was?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm going to turn it back over to Patricia, and we will wrap up.
Thank you, Courtney. Sorry I was having technical difficulties. You did wonderful. I really appreciate it. Dr. Tang, also many, many thanks to you for providing a very insightful and thought-provoking presentation today. We truly appreciate you taking the time to join us and to speak with the Texas Exes. And to the audience, thank you to everyone that participated in this month's event. We hope you've been enjoying this year's Lunchtime Lectures. The content's been amazing. But moving on into the summer, we have 2 exciting lectures planned for June and July. So for June, you can dive into the world of retail with Sarah Stewart-Stevens from UT's Division of Textiles and Apparel, and she's also part of our 2021 Texas 10, and that's happening on Wednesday, June 16th. And on Wednesday, July 21st, Karen Manis from the Texas Performing Arts will join us, and we'll discuss the research and history behind her book, The Art of the Hollywood Backdrop. So you can find information and you can register for these events on our website, which is texasexes.org/lunchtime lectures. And again, everyone, this will be recorded and we'll send that out to all of the participants. And hopefully we'll be able to include some of those references that Dr. Tang will give us. So thanks again, everyone, for joining. We really appreciate it. Y'all have a good week.